Okay, so this is how to start a survey paper. I originally wanted to talk about how to write a survey paper, then I realized this isn't about writing. The next lectures are about writing. This is about actually doing the research and structuring the ideas for your survey paper, not actually about all the writing. We'll be talking about writing for the next 2 weeks, so we'll get to that, but I wanted to today get through this because here is your next assignment. Your next paper assignment, which is your first real paper assignment, can be either done solo as a team of two. I really strongly want to recommend you do this as a team of two, but I recognize that some of you are working professionals and working with somebody else may be hard. The paper is much, much easier if you do it with another person, not just because you get to divide the labor, because you have somebody to talk to. Right? The hardest part of a good paper is trying to figure out the story you're going to tell. The hardest part of a survey paper is figuring out some of the things we'll talk about today, and it's much easier if you can have a long dialogue with somebody. Now, if you're doing it by yourself, your second person might be your advisor. And I'm okay if this ends up being a paper co-authored with your advisor, that's perfectly fine. I don't want them driving the first bit of work. You can bounce ideas off of them, but don't go implement their idea. This is the most important part of this is you're trying to figure out how to figure out what's the story of telling a good survey. I want you to do that. You can bounce the ideas off your advisor, talk about it with them, but stick to your ideas, not his or hers. Right? So where this is going to go. So a solo version of this, it's a paper of at least 8 to 10 pages, and actually I'll add the specification. That is in 2-column format. We'll use an IEEE format for that, with at least 30 references. The survey paper, for the team, the survey paper is 12 to 14 pages in length with at least 60 references. Okay, so what's the topic? Whatever you want to survey, but you're going to be graded not just on, in fact, more so, you're going to be graded on, did you actually put together a comprehensive, meaningful survey? Okay, and we're going to talk about what that means just a little bit. So I'm grading you on your ability to do this. This part is not as much about the writing as it is about organizing, structuring, and putting together the survey paper. There will be no grammar analysis in this. I will not be giving you, when we get to the final version, I might give you feedback. If I think this paper is good enough that you want to try and publish it, then we can add a little bit more to make that publishable, whatever. But the primary goal here is to get you thinking about how does one organize doing the literature search and doing the survey, not how do I write. Right? We'll get to writing later on, but we'll get there. So your first draft of this will be due in 2 weeks. Your final version of this will be in 4 weeks. So this is pretty much your primary assignment. You have the little journal assignment, which for the next couple of weeks will just be sort of like, here's my process. Right? In 2 weeks, you'll turn in a draft paper, and then in 4 weeks, we'll have the full version of the paper. Okay. Now, you might say you don't know how to do any of that. Well, that's why you're in this class. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. By the end of today, you will know how to put together the survey paper. Okay? Choosing the topic is a little bit harder because you might try 2 or 3 ideas before you see how they work up. Okay. The second thing, in 2 weeks after we get to draft, if you're in a pair, you will be given people from a different group. If you're a solo, you'll be given other people from a group. So each group will get at least 2 people giving feedback, which if you do the math means you're also giving feedback to 2 people, right? So there'll be another week. And I'm not positive about the 4-week deadline because of that. I forgot, when I laid out how much work this was, that you're also going to be doing a review in the middle. So I might push that final paper due to 5 weeks out. I think it's still enough time to make that work. We might start the next paper before then, but not have this one finished. Okay, so Google Scholar. We've already talked about this. So I'm clearly missing a slide because this starts in the middle of something. But so Google Scholar really is different than Google because Google crawls the public web. Google Scholar crawls a whole bunch of stuff behind publishers' paid firewalls. Google Scholar will tell you about things you can't get to because you don't have the money to get to it, but they'll tell you where it is, which is sort of an interesting piece of the model. So they modified the Google search algorithm, it's defined by Google, to still have some link-like analysis. So if you understand the original Google PageRank algorithm, it was based on eigenvalues of a large graph of who cites who. Well, Google Scholar uses some of that. That's why things are not pure citation order. Smaller number of citations in a higher venue will have more weight than more citations in a weaker venue because of the way the algorithm works out. The exact algorithm has never been published. I've talked to people who work for Google Scholar. They say no one's really sure. Right? There are people in the organization, but it's continually evolving. That's the biggest reason no one's really sure. It's like when they see problems, they try and fix it, right? So because it's an ongoing process for them. So they use citations to help relevance, but it's not the only thing. And so the nice thing is that it has this feature, which I will show you in just a little bit, about making sure you can access things through the library and showing out what's going on. They don't tell you, they don't create, so if you go talk to the reference librarians on campus, I've given this talk, very often they're getting around to Google Scholar, but when I first started giving this talk in 2005, when Google Scholar was invented in 2004, right, they were very anti-Google Scholar. So there are tools the research librarians on campus have. For this assignment, you are welcome and encouraged to go talk to the reference librarians and find out if they can help you find more relevant papers. The more obscure your area, the more they might be able to help you, right? But only if the area is properly indexed. So the biggest difference with Google Scholar is they don't have controlled vocabularies. You search with the words that are in the papers. In the Web of Science, which is the biggest other kind of index, right, there's a very standard lexicon that people map these words to those words, right, so that you can always have a consistent search, which is good if you know what those words are, and frustrating if you don't know what those words are, because then they don't find your words, right? You got to balance them out. They don't have standard abbreviations. They don't give you, the biggest complaint I get from librarians is, you can't tell who's in Google Scholar. And that's true. If I don't find it, I can't tell is it not in Google Scholar because they don't index it or because I didn't search for it. But it's not hard to go and find things that you know exist or not in Google Scholar. So, and that's gotten much better, but it's still a problem. And they don't decide on who tells you when things get updated. Google Scholar updates itself on a very weird, irregular basis, right? I will get some of the papers from a conference one week and other papers from the conference the next week. The conference was published all at once, but they split out over a couple of weeks, and that has to do with their calling process. But, so they tell you some things. So some things I want to make sure you know about searching in Google Scholar, and I'm not even sure everyone knows how Google works. People often just type in words and hope it works. But Google actually has what we in the search field is called a weak implied and, or weak and implied. So when you put a bunch of words in Google, right, you're asking Google to find this word and this word and this word and this word. But it's weak because it doesn't have to find all of them, right? Google has recently changed in the regular Google search and in Google Scholar, they're now starting to show you it must include certain words. They're effectively telling you this one doesn't include that word, right? So they're giving you a hint about what's going on. Most common words are completely ignored. And this is one of the important things that happens with Google Scholar. Very common words are completely ignored. Numbers are ignored. So if I'm looking for something, I'm saying, find me something on the Intel 8080. Actually, 8080 is a big enough number, it might search for it, but it might not, because it might say that's a number, I'm going to ignore it. But if you search for anything that's like, tree of size 4, the number 4 will always be ignored. Right? It's just way too common a number. So they're going to ignore it. So there's some ways to make sure it always includes those things by putting the word plus in front of it. So if I were to say tree of size plus the number 4, then the number 4 will be used. Another way is to put quotes around things. So if I put quotes around the word, it's going to say I have to have that word, which is not much different because, so they tell you that the quote marks me to search for a phrase. But if I search for a phrase of one word, it says you have to have that word. You can use the minus sign to exclude things from the search. This is very useful when you're finding all of this irrelevant stuff. So if you didn't know that, you can put the word minus and say don't include these. You can search for things by author, : that's pretty useful. You can force search terms to be only in the title. This can be very useful, but also very misleading because as you've seen from your browse, there's a lot of weird titles out there that don't really tell you what's going on in the paper. So you got to be careful with that. And you can restrict stuff by date and search, and you can do an advanced search screen, which is what I'm going to show you now. So of course I can't see everything. So I'll go to Google Scholar. Who would like to start their search? Not you. You've already done some search. Katrina. IoT. Okay, so I'm going to do this. So obviously, and luckily it knows how to spell things that I can't. So this is not a bad search. I got a bunch of stuff. But if I wanted to be particular, right? So I'm now going to go up here. There's the advanced search menu. Okay, so that search was actually equivalent to typing machine learning IoT in all of the words. Right now, if I want to make sure it has to have the IoT, I can put it down here, and now it's going to have that. And you can sort of see all the things I just mentioned are here. I can at least one of the words. So I can put down IoT here. Now it has to have the word IoT. I can't read this without the words. I can search anywhere or in the title. Unfortunately, with this syntax, I can't search like this word in the title and this word in the body. You're either searching the title or the abstract, which is a little confusing the way it's set up. And then the other ones that are very useful, I can look for only papers written by a particular author. That's the author by. This one can be useful. Only those published in something, right? So I could choose only a particular venue and say, only give me the papers that are in that venue. Okay. Some of you used that last week to sort of like find what venues are interesting.
Is there a format? I tried that last week with ACM, CCS. I couldn't, it wasn't pulling up.
Yeah.
It was just all over the place.
So yeah, finding out what the acronym so there is something, but the answer is you first have to find it to figure out what it's called. Right. So for example, like AAAI is just AAAI, right? But NIPS is Neural Information Processing System, right? So it depends on how the conferences are indexed in their web. So what I normally do is I look around to find one of those, right? And so by searching for its name in various forms, once I find it, then I can type it in here. So maybe there's a more formal process, but I don't know it, right? There's no list of everything that's published in it. And then you can do date ranges. Date ranges can be very useful because you can say, I don't want to see new things, or very often you want to find some of the earliest work in your field. And oddly enough, the earliest work might not be the most cited. Why not? Why won't the earliest work have the most citations? The field wasn't popular then, or maybe it was really popular, it just wasn't computerized back then, depending on how old you are, right? So papers in the 60s, I mean, Google has done a pretty good job of indexing, but you know what? People don't cite papers from the 60s very often anymore. And if you mean the 1860s, yeah, they're really not cited much anymore. But sometimes there's something nice about finding that original paper from the 1800s to cite it. You can put in search ranges. But it's also good to sort of, when you're doing a survey, sometimes it's really useful to sort of get a feel for when did the field become hot. And this can be a useful way of literally finding out. So if I ask about Katrina's question, and wow, this is, because the window is so small, it looks so different. I don't know where things are, but I can go down here and I can put in, oh, come on. I want my date range. I guess I have to do it over here. Normally there's a lot more room on your screen. You can see other things. It's got some menu choices on the thing. But let's say I wanted to find out how many papers were published before 2005 on machine learning and IoT. Well, I can't see at this angle, so what do I have wrong in there? Oh, machine learning I and IoT. Oh, published in a completely, okay, fine. Okay, so now there's probably still something, but right. So okay, so and it'll tell me up here somewhere. So well, who knows what it says. There's a bunch of them. So, but like if I could start working backwards in time, it's fine. Okay, when were the first papers? And you got to be careful. Just because they have those three words doesn't mean they actually were applying it, right? So you can, but this is where your scanning and browsing skills start to really become important, because you might be looking through quite literally hundreds of papers very quickly to sort of say, are these the relevant ones? And you got to decide if they're relevant or not. Okay, so we went through that. So this first paper here, which this link. I can't quite read it, but it sounds like it has thousands of citations, right? So you're now going to be, make sure I'm on track of mine. Yeah. So with Google Scholar, you can find all the papers that cite a given paper, and I can find all the related papers. I'm going to show you those two things next. Using these two techniques, you can generate hundreds of references that are related to what you want to do in under 5 minutes. Now, you can't analyze them all, but you can collect them all. So I want to show you how to do some of that, because that's part of what you're going to have to deal with. Right? And I'm going to use this idea of using your libraries with labels. And to do that, I also want to do one other thing, which I think is a useful technique. But no, I'll have to log in to do all that. Come on, mouse, where are you? So if I click on this, this is cited by, right? So that paper, this is the other part that can be useful. If this is a fundamental paper in machine learning and IoT, I can't read any of the titles, right? I now have however many papers this were, right, that cited that paper. Now, if there's thousands, you don't want a survey paper that's going to cite thousands. So let's say that Katrina is now taking a very special view of machine learning and IoT, and she's interested just in, say, support vector machines, because I support vector machines. That's what my shirt says. So I can now click this button and search just within those and say, if I could spell. Okay, so now I did say up there how many this went down to, but so now this was, if I just searched for SVMs and whatever, I might have got all kinds of papers, but I found this paper that somehow I thought was really important. Now I can find all the papers that cited it and find a subset of those that are related to my subtopic. Okay, now I have a list of a whole bunch of papers, right? And this is, I don't know how many's down here, but it's at least, at least 100 pages, or 100 papers. No, 140 papers, right? Now, if that paper was really relevant and anything that has SVMs were relevant to what I was trying to write about, I just found a whole bunch of papers. But that's still not done, right? And especially when you're in the beginning, you might not have all the right terminology. So for any one of these papers, I can go click on related articles, right? Now I have a bunch of papers that are all over the place, right? They don't necessarily have to have any of the words I searched for. And the related articles are driven by Google's eigen algorithm for documents, right? That's looking at saying these two documents have enough document level similarity for them to say they have some relationship. Now, some of that comes. If a paper cites the same paper, it's probably relevant. So there's a couple of extra rules they add to what makes it relevant. And it's not exactly published exactly what it is, but okay, so now I have only 100. That's right, it only gives you 100 related papers to any one. But if I start with 140 and I get 100 to each of those, right, now I have 1,400, right? So you'll have no problem quickly finding lots of papers. The hard parts are figuring out what are the relevant papers, okay? But now, hopefully, any questions about searching anything else in Google Scholar? One other thing, so you'll notice these are telling me which ones are full text at PDF at UCCS. One last thing is, and I can't see any of these here to know, but you'll notice like this one says all N versions. I can't see what N is, maybe 5. So what's interesting is the first version may not show me, this one is, it's showing me a version somewhere in Russia. Probably don't want to click on that one. If I click on it here, it will show me other versions, possibly at other locations, right? Sometimes this is useful because the default location will not be one you can actually access. It'll be down or whatever, so you can click on it. Very often the alternative versions will be slightly different versions. They might show something else. And sometimes, like if you're getting a paper and when you click on the BibTeX, so let me go back. And this is so different with all the small screen. It's not showing me my BibTeX thing, but right, so if I were to go click on this, it can show me like import into BibTeX. I will show you to make sure you can get that. So you can always get that through the double quotes over here, right? And then it'll show me down, there's something at the bottom that I can't get to that says import whatever, the BibTeX. You can make it just show you, right? But if I go to do this one, it may or may not show me a valid, so this is actually showing me the conference. This one's real. Sometimes you'll click on one and it'll show you like an archive version or something else, and you can just type it and fix it. But you should also know that if I click on the alternative versions, one of those alternative versions might actually have the right name of the venue. So this one's got the right venue here, so it's probably the right one. And this is actually, 2005 is probably old enough. There isn't any archive stuff in it because they were a little bit newer. So to show you how to make sure you get the other things, if I go down here, oh, come on, where's preferences? Probably hit it under the gear here. Okay. So under preferences, there's a bunch of things. I can't read them from this angle, but one of these, so you can choose to show them as an input or set them up to import into one thing. So you can set them up to import into BibTeX. Although if you're using Zotero, you can just, like, Zotero will let you click on the page and say, okay, add all 10 of these to my reference. The other part you can get to over here, go back, is, where's my library? Here we go. My library. So my library is a list of all of your papers. So these are all the like 280 papers that I have my reading list I haven't gotten to. I'll never get through it all anymore, but this is still also searchable by time, but if I go into my library, I can't read them over here, but my library, cited by, so these are a couple categories. Cited by me, manage labels. So if I manage labels, I can make up a new label. So let's say this was for Katrina, and I'm looking at ML IoT SVM, right? So I can now take that list of papers, right? And now if I go back to the ones that were listed, and I star them, there should be a star over here someplace, I can't see it, but, oh, I'm still in my library. Okay, so now if I click on these stars, it will add those papers to my library. Okay, so this is even faster and easier than like exporting them all to Zotero. So you can do your search, collect them all, and then you're going to browse through them to figure out which ones are even worth putting in Zotero. There's no point in putting them all in there, because you're going to look at these, you're going to click on the link and say, oh yeah, I've read the abstract, yeah, that's not relevant, just go through it real quick. And then you can delete the entire tag. There's a trash can for your library. You can throw everything else away. So that should allow you to very quickly go through and build a large corpus of those things that are relevant. I think they covered all my Google Scholar things. Oh no, one last couple of other things. So set up your preferences. If you're going to do this for real, and this is for class, you don't have to, but I would recommend this. You should set up an alert for any paper that is key to what you're writing about. So I have my alert set for a couple of different things. I get an email alert every time anyone cites one of my papers, and that's already a whole bunch. Every time somebody cites, so we were doing this work on OpenSet and out-of-data distribution, we were doing the NIPS paper. I set an alert while we were working on that paper for anything that cited any of the papers I was interested in. Why? Because if some new paper came out that cites those, I want to know about it now, not after I've submitted the paper, right? Because I want to be able to keep up with what's going on. And so those alerts are very useful. They'll send you an email about anything. You basically put in some papers or some keywords. They'll send you alerts anytime something cites those things. Use libraries to organize it. This last one's a little bit weird. Google, if you don't know this, Google uses like a whole bunch of your history to do all kinds of weird things. And if you're trying to do a search and you're trying to find new and fresh things, this is sometimes bad, because Google's going to keep showing you the things you clicked on before and things like those. So that search order, even though I put in the same keywords, Katrina would get a different list of papers. So the search order that Google shows me is no longer just relevance in a generic sense, it's personal relevance. So based on my search history, it'll show me one list of papers, and would show Katrina a completely different list. And that can be very difficult. I recommend, if you want to make sure you're getting a good, clean look at it, use Chrome, or Chrome is incognito, and Safari it's private browsing or whatever. Use one of those things that basically hides your history from Google, and then you can do it. It's tricky, because if you do that, you can't be logged in as you, so you can't get to your library. But you can use it as a check to sort of see what's going on. And that's it for Google Scholar. Any questions on Google Scholar? Okay, so now I'm going to start writing survey papers. So by far the most important part of a good survey paper is selecting the right topic. Okay, and what is that going to mean? Right. So what is a good topic? Well, so first, the subfield is newly emerging. Right. The field doesn't have to be newly emerging, but there's something new about the field that you want to survey. If the field's been around for 40 years and nothing has changed, it's probably not publishing many papers. So there must be something new, because people are publishing. So you have to find out what is that new thing, that new subfield that you want to be able to talk about. It doesn't actually have to be that new. Anything in the last 10 years might still be. If it's growing in popularity, that's sort of enough to make it interesting. You want something that's popularity is going to grow over time. Now, realistically, that's not a requirement for a good survey. You can write the definitive survey that kills a field. Right? It's not going to grow after this. But those really aren't exciting, because if the field's not growing, no one's citing it. So it's still marginal value for you. You need to have a critical number of papers of new algorithms and approaches that exist, at least 20 to 40 new things, right? So your assignments were like 30 to 60 citations, right? Not all of them have to be new things, but you need enough new stuff to make a good story around them. If there's not that many new topics, then your topic may be too narrow. If there's way too many, if there's 400 new things, your topic is too broad. right? You're going to have to figure out how to narrow that down to make it in the sweet spot of, to be honest, it could be 20 to 100, depending on what journal you're going after, but I'm not going to make you go that far. Really, some of you ought to be enthusiastic about this topic. Why? Because you're going to spend a good bit of time on this. Don't do it because you think this will be important, but I hate it. Right? Because if you become known for a topic that you hate, it's not good for you. It's not just the time you're going to spend on this paper. If you read a really good survey paper, I did one on digital forensics and stuff, right? I get requests to review digital forensics. I get people wanting to talk, right? I haven't done digital forensics in 10 years now, right? Well, we were starting a new project. We started one last year, but for years, like I did that. It was the end of a project, right? It was a bad idea. Why? Because it's not something I wanted to keep working on, but I keep getting requests to work on it, so it's a weird thing to do. So make sure you're enthusiastic about keeping to work on it. So lots of people will tell you that a survey paper does not exist in this topic, right? That's an important thing. And you're going to present a new and useful organization of this space. Okay, in my view is if you can do 6, it doesn't matter if a survey paper exists. So in fact, Birali, the guy who's I got some of these slides from, did some analysis around 2002, I think. But it turns out that survey papers in an area that already have a survey paper get more citations. Not that they are precluded because there's a survey paper. Now there's a couple of caveats. If a survey paper on exactly your topic came out last year, it is probably not going to get accepted. So we can't actually measure its citations because there's what's called a survivor bias, right? By the time the paper got published, somebody thought it was new and different enough from the other surveys to get published, right? So there's still quite likely the risk that if a good survey paper on the topic exists, yours will be rejected. But if it does get published, that means it's often, and one of the reasons for this is fields are sometimes growing quickly. So a survey paper in this sub-area might be out there and you write one in this sub-area, and that's good because now there's a bunch more people interested in this. So you don't have to say, I can't do this because there's a survey in this area. It can't be in the same micro subfield area, right? So I couldn't do a survey paper on adversarial examples in computer vision because one came out last month, okay? But I could do one in adversarial examples in natural language or in malware or whatever, right? So you can find a slight variation to make stuff happen. So I'm going to skip over some of the numbers. Survey papers, and one of the reasons you want to think about this is early in your career, survey papers tend to have higher citations than research-only papers and tend to have higher citations than things that mix survey and research. A pure survey paper, and a good one, will get lots of citations if you do a good job at it. I have multiple survey papers in my resume. Most of them that are more than 3 years old have a couple of hundred citations. I made many of my PhD students, when they were students, do a survey paper that did not include me as an author, many of which have thousands of citations, right? Because they're a little bit older and they were well done survey papers. So a good survey can really help launch your career in terms of getting things done. So what is the structure of a survey paper? I like to think of a good survey paper is something that helps the reader compartmentalize the world, right? 40 papers is not a lot. If you do a survey paper with 100, you really have to compartmentalize it because people don't want to view it as, here's a list of 100 things. You want some structure that helps you break it down. So in some of our papers, we've done this sort of cube model where it's like, here's 3 dimensions that are really important. This dimension, this dimension, this dimension. You put papers along an axis. You help people understand how they varied over time. The axes should not be time. Time is not an interesting axis. You want to have an axis, so I can't remember. So here we had scalability, incremental learning, and open set learning. And we put different pieces of the research literature on different points in the space. This was actually a paper that also included new work, which put our point at some other point in the space, right, to help differentiate our work. So, in fact, all of you will always be doing a survey because most research papers include a section called related work, which is a micro survey. Right? The more you can figure out how to write a good survey, the more useful those sections will become when we get to those in your paper. Okay? Another classic approach is to break the world up into a tree-like classification. Right? Well, there's a binary decision. Either it has this property or that property. And then after it has this property, it has this property or that property. Right? You can do this dichotomy. Sometimes in papers, you actually draw this thing out. Other times you don't bother. Right? But you talk about the classification. So our survey on digital forensics did a bunch of this. It put things in different categories. And in fact, we invented a few categories. It's a little bit novel, right? But we'll talk about why that can be very useful. So, but your goal in the survey is not a giant list of papers. It's to help people navigate the space and sort of connect things that should be connected and separate things that should be separated in some novel and interesting way. So you're taking your viewpoint of when you did your critiques, right? Here's how things are, what's wrong. Well, you're also saying, here's all the things that are related in the same way. They all solve this subproblem. Here's some stuff that solves this subproblem, or here's things that solve it this way. I'm not telling you how to separate them, but that's your job in the survey, is to come up with some classification criterion. And whether or not it ends up in your paper, it's really good when you first start this, before you get too far down, to come up with this idea of a figure that includes how are you breaking stuff up, what is the classification and the mnemonics that may help you do this. Mnemonics are useful because people can't remember really complicated things. So if you can come up with a mnemonic to make it memorable, a name, that you can name this and have your taxonomy make some sense. You want to come up with an idea of the selected number of examples you want to have per classification category. And you want to list the references of the selected example. So these last two things, you're now looking at trying to find things. And oddly enough, if I've done a good job with this, when we were doing, for example, this cube one, we actually said, you know, one of our axes doesn't have many papers. Let's go find a few more papers to fill out that dimension. Right? We can choose whatever papers we want to put in our survey. So once you figure out what is your story, what's your classification, you begin to start trying to find papers to make that story work out. If you can't find them, change the story, try again, you can iterate a little bit. So for example, if we're looking at internet search algorithms, right, I could start some high level, so I could look at those that are separated based on, are they using a multi-rational databases, or are they doing conceptual modeling analysis? I could look at things that didn't do random searches and targeted searches. You basically come up with some way of ordering them that you can tell a story about. Now, is this a particular meaningful thing? That depends on the story I'm trying to tell. But that's the biggest part of your survey paper. If you can quickly come up with, here's a novel way of decomposing this space into a bunch of boxes and then put papers in those boxes, the rest of the survey paper is actually very easy. Because now it's about writing what makes things be in this box, how do the things in this box compare, and how do boxes contrast. Right? And if you've done a good job, how many of you actually read a survey paper so far, right? And the survey paper you did, was it a good survey paper? Did you like it? Did it have that kind of structure that helps you understand how things are put together? That's your goal, right? It's not, some people come into this having read good survey papers, they think, well, here I'm going to have a summary of every paper. That doesn't actually help you a lot. It helps a little bit, but I can just read abstracts in Google Scholar and get a summary of every paper, right? I want something that helps me organize my knowledge, and that's what you're aiming for. So when you're trying to look at these examples, I like to think about starting out with these 7 items. Not all of them will necessarily show up in the paper, but for each of the papers, you want to sort of say, okay, here's the 7 items about this paper. Sort of the very basic stuff: who, what, when, where, why, how, whom, right? I mean, some of that will show up because you just want to have some of that in the paper. The next one is the most important one. What is the essence of this paper? Can you boil it down to a 2-sentence summary of what is the critical value of this paper? You know, like when you were scanning, you try to say, here's the 2 or 3 sentence version, except here you've generally gone through the paper. Now you're trying to give it a very detailed, so you've done more of a read than a scan. Maybe not the complete critical read. Surprisingly, if you're doing a survey paper, you might scan the paper and do a light read that takes you 15, 20 minutes, right? Because you're really trying to analyze one part of this paper. You're not trying to build on it, you're surveying it. So as long as you can understand it enough to put it in the survey, you don't have to understand everything because it's not directly your research, it's a survey piece element. Any ideas of the structure of the paper, if they're relevant, some relevant details. So these are things you may or may not have. I like to always try and pull out at least one example that I would look at the paper. To me, an example is a great way of typifying this is what the paper is. It could be a figure, or it could be a couple of sentences that help understand what the experiments are. But you're really trying to say, here's something that I could use to show what makes this happen. Now, in your final paper, you will not have, if you have 60 papers, you're not going to have 60 examples. Okay? But what you want to do is, while you're going through the papers, you pull out an example as the best example from this paper, because then when you're writing the paper, you can say, okay, I can afford in my space 12 examples. What are the best 12 out of 60? Right? And pull out the ones that really make sense to help you tell your story. It's really hard to tell the story until you've seen all the research, but when you're doing the research, you haven't figured it out. So you want to collect more information here than you're going to need. Your sort of pros and cons and your opinion of the examples and its potentials, where it would go. So sort of this is the kind of notes you would take while you're scanning. This is not anywhere near the list we had in our critical read, where there's a whole bunch more questions trying to answer. These are just, okay, here's the things I want in my notes about this paper. And then you chug through a bunch of papers. For short surveys, each of these is one sentence, maybe two. For longer surveys, which actually both of the surveys I would say we're doing in here are short. Long surveys are like 40 pages. We had one that was 70, right? So it depends on how long. The students who I mentioned had 1,000 citations. One was a 180-page survey. It became a book. The other was an issue, right? It was the issue, like the entire. So it was big. Both of them were pretty big. So for books, they can be longer. But so this good survey paper is now about taking all those pieces and weaving them into a story. And the story, we'll talk more about storytelling next week. The story may or may not be the story you started with. Do not get stuck into sort of the sunk cost fallacy that, I've put all this effort into these, I can't waste them, I got to keep them. Okay? Just like when you're writing a paper, the most important part of writing a paper is often the editing, where you throw stuff on the floor and get rid of it. Right? The same is true when you're looking at papers for a survey paper. The most important thing you might do is say, these papers are not going in the survey. I've written my little summary of them, but they don't work in my story. Just because you read them doesn't mean they belong in your survey. They don't work with what you're trying to tell, right? You just have to give them up and let them go. They can show up in some survey later. They might, depending on how you want to get to it, they might become reduced to a single sentence in your survey where you say, and other papers really don't quite address the problem in a formal way. Cite, right? You just added 4 citations to papers you read, but they really don't work within the story except to say, yeah, these don't really work in my story because I was talking about formal methods. And they're not formal, right? But they're still out there, right? At a certain point, they don't even add enough value to keep adding too many of those. So, in summary, a good survey is not a summary. You have to compare and contrast the papers. You've got to tell a story, and you really got to tell a story with a theme and a goal, and we'll talk more about themes and goals in writing next week. And you're really trying to do this to help others organize ideas for others, so that they can see your view of how to organize the world. Right? It may not be the only way of organizing the world, but it's a way that can help people understand what to do. And it need not be complete. That is, you don't have to worry about citing everything that is relevant. That is, again, not your goal. But it should be thorough within the theme and story. Right? You have to cite enough of it, okay? And you have to make sure you're not missing any of the big things in that subfield. Because if a reviewer says, well, you're talking about machine learning and IoT, but you completely missed this entire suite of papers because they didn't use NVIDIA chips, they used AMD chips or whatever, right? And they're an AMD person, right? That's it, your paper's in serious trouble, right? So you don't want to miss large pieces, but don't worry about it all being complete or thorough. A complete or thorough paper in a medium-sized field would be hundreds of citations, right? Not dozens, right? Unless it's extremely new. So. Okay, so how are you going to do this? So, and you've already started, hopefully, down this process. I didn't tell you that, but you want to read about the general subject to warm up, right? So last week you did some browsing, or last 2 weeks you've done some browsing. Hopefully that's a field that's of interest to you because you chose the field, right? So now you've browsed a bunch of papers. You've actually seen a bunch of stuff, not even just what you were thinking you wanted to work on. You've seen some broader stuff. So you've gotten some feel for what those things are. The next thing, we talked about choosing a venue. You want to target a particular journal. Journals publish more surveys than conferences. Very few conferences publish survey papers. So you're really targeting a journal for that. There's a couple of very generic journals, journals that I didn't mention. So by far the best known journal for computer surveys is ACM Computer Surveys. That's the name of the journal. They publish surveys in just about anything. So you definitely want to look at some of those. It'll also give you an insight by looking at some of their papers and saying, wow, here's a bunch of survey papers and different topics, here's what can go on. You also want to make sure you locate any related surveys. So Google Scholar does not have a button that says find me survey papers, but you can add the word survey in this subject. This is one of the times when using the title is actually pretty important, because the word survey will occur in lots of papers, in part because lots of papers will cite surveys, and so like the word occurs in tons of papers. So putting the word survey or review, because those are the two most common words to say this paper is a survey paper or a review of a bunch of papers, do a Google search with those in the title, and you'll find related ones. Okay? I would recommend you search back at least 5 years. If it's more than 5 years old, it doesn't matter. You can do a new one because a lot has changed in any field in 5 years. It's still publishing. But knowing where they are, it's still good to be able to take a slightly different tilt from one that's 4 years old. They went this way, I'll go a little bit this way, right? So you understand where they are. The other point is, if you can find out what papers they cited, you can actually play an interesting game. What can you do with, if you know, here's a survey paper that cited a bunch of papers, what can you do with that? Right, so, well, but I'm trying to do something newer than them. So I can find all the papers after they published that cited them. Very few papers cite you before you're published, so just finding the papers that cited that survey paper gives you a list of papers since then that is related to that topic. And then you play the game we just talked about, looking at cited papers, what are they cited, what's related, and you quickly build up a whole bunch of things related to that survey that aren't in that survey. Therefore, you can do a survey that adds real value to people because there's another 150 papers that haven't been surveyed yet. We can put those together in some interesting way. So you wanted to determine your proposed classification approach and select 40 to 80 papers on various approaches from the literature based on your classification ideas. Now this is the trickiest part, because if you choose a classification, you'll get one set of 40 or 80 papers. If you change the classification, not all those papers will fit in the classification. There's a little bit of iteration here. You might actually be going through more like 120 papers to get your 40 or 80, depending on how much you change your idea a couple of times. But if you want a good survey paper, don't stick with it because you found 40 and I can make a paper around them. You could do that for this assignment, but that's not really practicing the right way. You want to figure out, what can I really turn into an interesting story out of these papers? Okay? And I recommend you actually write down at the beginning of your paper, so your draft, right? You don't have to turn this in, but you should write down, here's why I think this classification is important in a contribution to science. Okay, I will tell you, that classification description is going to show up in the beginning of your draft, right? Because you're going to say, here's a survey, here's our classification scheme, and here's why it's important. Right? So you're going to want to do that. So write it down early so you can look at it and say, you know, I buy that, that's good, or it's not. You can share that with a team member or with anyone else in class and say, is this a good thesis? Right? That's really what you're talking about, a thesis in the traditional English sense of the word. This is the main idea that this survey is going to cover. Here's a classification, and here why that classification is important for people to understand. Right? And if you do that well, the rest of the paper follows after that. So spend a good bit of your time trying to make sure that works out. Once you have a good thesis, if you can't find 40 or 50 papers on it, we'll talk about how to broaden it just a little bit to make it so you can get there. But you don't have to broaden it very fast to get to 60 papers. You can actually do a good survey with only 10 new papers and enough stuff around it to argue why this is such an important new field, and there's enough things to take away from these 10. It would be tricky, but you could probably make that work. Okay, so for each of the 40 to 80 papers you're looking at, look at the 7 main ideas I already mentioned earlier. Put those in your notes and then sort of organize them to make it easy to do the comparisons and therefore represent the contribution to science. Pick the key points for comparisons among the paper. You might have started out with one idea, but after you took your notes, you found there's some other organizational changes. So even though you started with the classification, don't live with it. Go back and fix it to better match what you found and tell that story. For each key point of comparison, generate 2 figures, for example, a block scheme diagram or some pseudocode representing the algorithms or something showing a result. To be honest, each point of comparison, right, isn't, if I have 60 papers or 40 papers, right, 40 40 choose 2 is too many. I can't afford to do that all. So you're choosing a couple of, when I said key, I didn't mean a key among every pair of papers, right? There's 40 papers. What are the 3 or 5 or 7 big things they want to get across as the big differences in my hierarchy or my cube or whatever to help highlight those dimensions, right? And choose an example for each of those key dimensions or the key factors in my tree. If I have a tree that's got too many branches in it, if it's got more than about 8 leaves, thin it down, right? Because I can't tell a story of 200 things. I can tell a story of 7 plus or minus 2. And actually, I like to think of it as more like 5 plus or minus 2. Because 7 is already a pretty complicated story. So in a short paper, don't go to too many. But that doesn't mean you choose only those. You might actually try out 8 ideas and keep 5. So that's okay. You can do a few more comparisons. Because some of them might make, look, oh man, it's another block diagram. I already have 3 of those. I need something that looks more visually interesting than another block diagram. This one's got real images, or this has got like code or graphs. I'll use this as my comparison. Right? Those comparisons can and often are graphs out of the papers or figures out of the papers you use. You can cite a figure and put it in your paper. Okay? Better surveys will often compare things on dimensions that were not in the paper, with data that was in the paper, but not using graphs or examples from the paper. Because if two papers have a similar related graph, I can copy the numbers and put them in Excel and have one plot that actually compares the two, even though neither paper compared with each other. Right? Now I've really added to people's understandings. Like, these people never compared against themselves, but here, this one's clearly better than that one in this dimension. In fact, in someone's journal, they mentioned, is it common for people to make up new metrics? Absolutely. In fact, in your survey paper, it is not uncommon for a survey paper to make up a new metric, just so they can compare things, because that's part of your contribution. You know, everyone's looked at it this way. But, you know, maybe we should be looking at it as sort of cycles per person hour instead of cycles per second, right? Okay? And if you can find some statistics from which you can compute that data, you get a very interesting new survey, new way of looking at the world. By looking at it differently, because you have a new metric that no one wants to look at. You have to argue why that metric's important, right? But from a company point of view, right, cycles per second is not near as much as cycles per programmer effort. Right? So maybe that's why, you know, I'm just making stuff up on the fly. So doesn't mean. Interestingly, if your classification process generated a class without any examples, that is, so you have a dichotomy or a dimension, and you say, look, there's a void here, right? This structure says there should be something in this category. We could find no papers in this category. That is really interesting to people, and it's really interesting to you. Why? Because you've just identified something for which there's a good reason to believe there should be research in this space, and there isn't any. We call it white space. Research in white space is way more interesting because you're not competing with the 17 people at Stanford and 5 at MIT that are also working on this crowded space. You're in a space that no one else is looking at because you've looked at the world from a new point of view. If you choose not to go down that space, that's fine. If you choose, because your survey paper will point other people, right? Lots of people will read survey papers looking for where is there an opening? Where is there a goal, a space for me to move my research? Right? I'm reading, these are done, this is done, this is done, what's left to do? Like, early PhD students often get very depressed. It's like, there's nothing left. Right? They've done it all. It's like, oh no, there's plenty. You got to find the space. So you definitely want to highlight that. Sometimes, however, it highlights a hole in your search process, because once you've identified that hole, go look for new papers, because there might be some stuff in there you just didn't label it properly. Right? So if there's not people who are doing bidirectional underwear communication, maybe they don't call it bidirectional. Maybe they call it, you know, full duplex. And you just didn't use the right word. Right? I'm not, you know, whatever. So once you identify it, go looking for it to make sure it's there. Define your research strategy. Define the research strategy for those who decide to analyze the hybrid approaches. So you want to be setting up this to help other researchers. So you could say, you know, these two areas might be interesting to combine. Here's what might come out of that. This is the discussion. Here's two areas where, you know, these two have this in common and that's different. So maybe there's some ways of doing it. So you're really in the discussion, this is the last part of your survey, you're really trying to say, here's possible research directions. And again, as a PhD student, you identifying possible research direction is great for you. But in a survey paper, putting them out there for other people to work on, right, is a great opportunity for them. Right? So that survey paper will help other people find research directions that might be related to yours, or your advisors, or whatever else you want to do. If you can define other possible new solutions, sort of the idea of symbiosis or synergy, like these things combined, right? Or, well, if we could just do this, here's a potentially interesting way of looking at that problem. Unlike a research paper, you can do a little bit of this in the future work section of a research paper. In a survey paper, speculating about new research directions is perfectly fine. It's common. You don't have to have the answers. You're, based on all this research, you're saying, here's these things that aren't done. Maybe here's some interesting ways of looking at it. You can't have 8 pages of that and 4 pages of survey, but if I have 12 pages to go and I have a page that's really future directions, that's all perfectly fine. At this point, you want to add the preamble and the conclusion. You probably started with some of those, but which is really to form the final part of the paper. I actually recommend you start trying to have one pearl of wisdom, one seed of an idea that is the most important thing of your paper. That wants to show up in the preamble, in the intro, and in the conclusion. And it actually helps if you know what that idea is before you start and you can write towards it, but sometimes it comes out as you're doing this, right? So you write the paper. Honestly, for lots of our papers, we write the abstract first and last. You write the abstract, you start doing the work, you write the paper, and then after you're done, you realize the abstract has nothing to do with what you did. You go back and rewrite it to actually reflect what the paper has. So you started with that idea, but at the very end, you want to go back and now, given what's written, you want to figure out, here's the one pearl that I can actually really point to, is pull out throughout the paper, and you might have to go back and polish it up in various places so that you can make sure it's visible. Having that one or two essence summary of your paper greatly increases the chance that it'll actually be referenced a lot and referred to by people and more acceptable, because oddly enough, an 8-page paper that I can summarize in 2 sentences is a great idea, is easy to remember. An 8-page paper that I can summarize in only 8 pages is actually not very useful because its content is itself. I didn't get much out of it. And then you're going to ask your peers to review your paper and edit. We'll get to the asking your peers to review your paper and edit in this class. And edit after that. We're not going to push you to actually publish this paper. But for many of you, if you don't yet have sufficiently advanced research, this will be the paper you can easily publish out of this class. At the end, we're going to do the survey paper and a research paper in this class, different from the last time I taught it. I'm going to make sure you can do a little bit of both. One of them may be much stronger than the other because your research paper may have, and then magic happens because you haven't done the research yet, right? There's no real paper there because you know what you're going to do, you haven't done it yet. For those people who have done that, a good survey paper is also chapter 2 of your thesis. Right? It really is the related work. So a 8 to 12 page chapter of all the related work is a great place for your thesis to be in terms of development. Here's this piece of it. So it may never be a paper, it may just become that piece of it. So look at this as an opportunity for you to be exploring. Here's a research direction, and I'm trying to find a hole to get space for me to work in. That's really the most valuable part of what you will get out of the survey paper if you're not already doing research. If you're doing research, then it's here's the chapter I'm going to put in my thesis. Even if you never publish it, this will be a very useful exercise. And then if you want, submit the paper to a journal, or stick it as chapter 2 of your thesis, whatever. Questions? Okay. If you're going to work in pairs, you might want to talk to people before you leave today. Within the system, right? You can. I think you send each other mail through the Canvas system. Right? So even if you don't know who you are, you can look them up and send them mail. I want to strongly recommend you try and find a partner. You will find it both more enjoyable and probably more productive to be able to talk about these ideas with somebody. Okay, even if it's not your particular area. You working on somebody else's survey might help you understand, right? But if you want to do your own survey, it's okay to do this entirely on your own. So, I will be posting the actual written assignment up in Canvas probably tomorrow. I have another class tomorrow, so Wednesday. So if your partner is not in this class, I'm just asking that, so if you're in this class, you're both going to be doing the assignment from this point of view. If you're going to have a partner not in this class, don't listen to them. Here's the topic, here's the class. I want this to be something you do. It's okay if you discuss it with them, but I really want you to be driving that part of, here's the classification and the organizational stuff we want to do. And if you're doing it with another person in this class, the two of you will be working on that together. But if you choose a more senior person, like Jugal, right? Jugal will say, here, do a survey in this, right? He'll already have an idea about it. That's not you thinking about what's the right idea. So, and if you're not sure, send me a mail. We can chat about it.